Hi everybody, welcome to this week's discussion of FLS Chapter 1, What Shaped Our World and Historical Introduction. So in this reading does two things, and so the first thing it does is it talks about the 5 major historical events or moments that shaped our world and why these were so significant, and how we got to a point where we organized ourselves into nation states and why that matters. And so a couple of things to start. One is that a state is an organization that maintains monopoly of violence over a territory. So that's Max Weber's definition. And this sounds a little weird to begin with, I think. And so we usually don't think of states as organizations, and we usually don't necessarily think of them in terms of violence over a territory. But these are the 3 main things that Weber says you need in order to have a state. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we're talking about O'Neill in a couple of weeks. The second thing that is important to start off with is that states are fictional and borders are imaginary. And so what we mean by that is we think about sort of the way the world is divided up now as pretty stable, and nation states is the basic building blocks of everything we're talking about when we're talking about international politics. And so states relate to each other. And so that's international relations. States go to war, states trade, states sign treaties together. And then we compare what happens within states, right? So states have different types of government, states have different political cultures and things like that. But what this chapter is trying to make clear is the idea that these borders didn't happen naturally. And so there's nothing inherent about Thailand to make it Thailand. There's nothing inherently United Statesy to make it the United States. And so these borders that were drawn on the map, and this is true some places more than others, are basically entirely fictional. And then they take on these sort of real world consequences. And so one of the major questions that we ask is, why do we organize ourselves into nation states? Is that the best way that we can organize ourselves socially and politically? And how did we get to a point where the nation state becomes the basic way that we organize ourselves? So in order to give sort of a brief background, the history of international politics in 30-ish minutes, the place that we sort of should start is when globalization starts. And so globalization is this moment that we're at right now where, borders are becoming less important, where, information technology and trade and politics are becoming less significant in countries, and we're starting to increasingly make all of these economic and political decisions across countries. So we're at this moment of globalization. And this starts around 1500, when trade becomes possible due to advances in technology and in transportation and in interests in sort of seeing what exists beyond European, basically, borders. So between 15 and 1700, it's this period of rapid colonization. European foreign policy of colonialism dictates policy on almost every continent. And so Europeans start to explore, they start to colonize different countries, they start to exploit the natural resources of those countries. And the economic strategy is called mercantilism, which is the idea that military power and economic influence should complement each other. And so colonial empires in the 16th to 18th century favor the mother country over its competitors. And so at this moment, globalization doesn't look like trade, and instead it looks like exploitation. And so what you see in this cartoon is, the mother country wearing all of these elaborate jewels and saying, no, you shouldn't have, as one colony presents gold and silver, one colony presents foodstuffs, and one colony presents raw materials. And so these colonies are very much considered sort of servants of the mother country and of the empire. And so as Europe is extending beyond its own boundaries, what's happening on the European continent is pure sort of European madness, as all of these tiny states struggle for hegemony over the continent and are trying to figure out sort of what their place is in this global order. And so the first important thing that happens from 1618 to 1648 is that the French and the Dutch and the other European allies all gang up versus Spain, and you have the 30 Years' War. And the 30 Years' War ends in the Peace of Westphalia, so this might be something for you to star if you don't remember it from history class. But the Peace of Westphalia is the beginning of the modern state system and introduces the concept of sovereignty, which is the idea that a state has ultimate authority within its territorial boundaries. And so what happens here is that for the first time in the European continent is this promise that gets broken, that states get to make all of the decisions within their boundaries, and that that we're going to organize ourselves by nation states, at least in Europe. So this sets off a 150-year battle for hegemony. So once you have these states that we're going to respect state boundaries, the question is which states are going to be the most powerful. And the battle for hegemony is between England and the other European countries. This sort of culminates in the 7 Years' War in the United States, which is also called the French and Indian War sometimes. This war ends French dominance, and then in 1815 there's the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which seals British hegemony. So Napoleon goes off to St. Helena, goes into exile, and the world takes a deep breath. And so this leads to a period that's called Pax Britannica, which is 100 years of peace between the end of the French and Indian War and the outbreak of World War I. And so Pax Britannica is this pretty amazing moment in global history. After all of this fighting that's happened since the 1600s, Britain adds 10 million square miles and 400 million subjects to its empire. So you see an increase in life expectancy, you see an increase in GDP, which is the gross national product, and you see this sort of taking hold across the globe. So Pax Britannica works for a couple of reasons, and so people don't challenge Britain's hegemony for a few reasons. One is the idea that Britain balances out other countries, and so whenever one country starts to get too powerful, Britain took the side of sort of the little guy, and so Britain acts as this global balancer. All of the countries at this point have a shared distrust for democracy and revolutions. And so there's this sense that we want to keep democracy from spreading. And so all European countries feel like this is a good thing to sort of suppress democracy. And so they see what happens at the American Revolution, they don't like it. What happens in the French Revolution, they don't like it. And so this is sort of a shared goal. It also works because of free trade, and so you see a shift away from mercantilism, and there's advances in communication and transportation, and so you see trading happening between partners. And as we'll talk about later in the semester, when countries trade, they tend not to go to war with each other. And finally, you have the gold standard, which pegs currencies to gold, and most of the world uses this by the 1870s, which becomes a way to sort of broker these trading exchanges. So Pax Britannica sounds great, and in many ways, for many people, particularly on the European continent, it's a good story. But the story is incomplete when you just think about Pax Britannica as a victory. What complicates this story is that the peace is between nations, but it's not within nations. And this growth is taking place at the expense of native people and slaves. And so even though you see rapid economic growth, what's happening within the colonies is extremely violent, and you see, a rise of slave labor being used to grow these economies. Europe is relatively calm, but all of Africa is under colonial rule except for Liberia and Ethiopia, which means that there's an entire continent being subjugated to exploiting these natural resources. Britain controls all of Southeast Asia. And then the Netherlands, Germany, Japan, and US take over the rest of Southeast and East Asia. So you see this dividing up of the globe in a way that almost universally subjugates the people that live in these other countries to lives of exploitation. So this is a map that you can see of what colonial powers looked like in 1900. And so as you can see, Britain controls quite a lot of the globe. The Netherlands controls quite a lot of the globe here. You have Spanish and French colonies here, and so the whole globe is basically divided into French West Africa, et cetera, et cetera. And so the globe is divided very much into these colonial powers that are controlled by Belgium, France, the German Empire, Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, the US, and then there are a few independent states here and there. So what are the impacts of colonialism? The first thing is that it strips countries both of their resources and also of strong institutions. And so what ends up happening in these countries is that they set up some sort of colonial rule. The colonial rule oftentimes completely supplants whatever type of political organization they had ahead of time. So any sort of local leadership or national leadership tends to be deposed, and people tend to be put in charge that are friendly to the colonists. There are also two types of colonial governments. And so one type of colonial government would strip countries of their resources, and so it's an extraction-based economy. And then others, Great Britain tended to build institutions as they went. And so the United States, Australia, India, other British empires tend to be stronger and better off today than Spanish colonies, for instance, because Spanish colonies tended to be subjugated to a great deal of extraction without strong institutions being built. The second thing that happened is that countries are stripped of any sort of local or national or ethnic identity. And so, as you see, particularly at the end of colonialism, when these arbitrary states are created in the Middle East and Africa, it's very hard to create any sense of cohesive national identity when your states are sort of arbitrarily drawn. And it also creates these false national allegiances that lead to genocide, like you see places like Rwanda. And so there are these huge, long-lasting impacts of colonialism. And as we'll talk about in the chapter on developing countries, you still see those impacts today. So after colonialism, you have 30 years of crisis part one, which begins with World War I. And so from 1914 to 1918, the Allied and the Central Powers go to war. Those are the two sides. And so you can see here the way that the map is drawn. So you have Ireland, Great Britain, France, Portugal, most of Northern Africa, Italy, Serbia, Romania, Russia as the Allied. The Central Powers are the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, Austria-Hungarian Empire, Germany, Luxembourg. And then you have neutral powers like Spain, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland. So here are top 6 things to know about World War I. So first, as you probably remember from your history classes, World War I starts when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28th, 1914. So his assassination is certainly the straw that breaks the camel's back. And so it leads to the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. And so we talked about how the Peace of Westphalia is what starts the idea of the nation state. But what colonialism does is it builds these massive empires where, you have these sort of weak states that are organized into these empires. And World War I is very much the end of the period of empires. The European economies are absolutely devastated in terms of human and material costs. In the interwar years, dissatisfied middle classes lead to the support of right-wing movements, which sort of foreshadows what happens in World War II. The Treaty of Versailles formally ends World War I on June 28th, 1919. And so there's exactly 5 years between the assassination of the Archduke and the Treaty of Versailles being signed. And the Treaty of Versailles is also extremely important in setting up the nation-state system. And so it sort of takes these failed empires and divides them into different states. And then the final thing that's important to know is that the United States swoops in during interwar years and takes advantage of this disaster to become the biggest economic leader in the world. So here's what the map looks like before and after World War I. And as you can see, the biggest sort of takeaway is that there are a lot more states, and not all of them are particularly strong. But as you can see, like Poland reappears on the map. Poland appears and disappears from the map quite a bit over time. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania appear on the map. East Prussia, which is now considered Germany, which is now East Germany, appears in the map. Czechoslovakia appears in the map. And so, the Russian Empire is carved up into individual nation states. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire is carved up into individual nation states. The Ottoman Empire becomes Turkey and other individual nation states. And so the world all of a sudden has a lot more states in it. So then, from 1939 to 1945, you have the 30 Years of Crisis, Part 2, which is World War II. World War II probably gets into sort of the territory that you remember the most. But you have, the United States, Canada, Brazil, the USSR, China, the UK, Australia are allied powers, and then the Axis powers, as you probably remember, are Germany, Italy, Japan, Romania. So the things that you might not remember and know about World War II, first it becomes this massive territorial battle over Central Europe. And so, we talked a few slides ago about how Poland is created. Poland becomes sort of the linchpin of this crisis, where Germany invades Poland, violates its territorial integrity, and that drags the rest of Europe in. Russia also is fighting for Polish territory, and so Central Europe becomes this massive dividing line between Western Europe and the rest of Europe. The economic collapse that led to anti-colonial and nationalist sentiment in the global South, particularly in Latin America. And so we don't often talk about the impact of World War II on non-European countries, but one of the things that it does is leads to the end of colonization. And so just as the end of World War I leads to the end of empires, the end of World War II leads to the collapse of colonialism. The numbers of people killed are staggering. So 110 million people fought. 7 million people are killed in the Holocaust. 30 million civilians are killed. 20 million people from the Soviet Union alone die. Europe and Japan are utterly decimated. Germany, Japan, Italy, France, and Britain are no longer great power players. So there are only two powers left, which are obviously the United States and and Russia and the USSR, right? So this leads to the Cold War. And so, as you know, World War II ends. When World War II ends, you have a couple of things happen. And so the Allied powers basically divide up Germany, right? And so they, in Berlin, there's a sector for the USSR, a sector for the United States, a British sector, and then a German sector. And so there's that sort of division that's happening. And basically the big question is, how do you keep Germany from triggering yet another world war, but also make sure that you don't make the economic decisions that led to the collapse of the economy like last time? But very quickly, the world reorganizes itself into the United States versus the USSR, into the Cold War. And so a bipolar world order is created, with the United States on one side and the Soviet Union on the other. And this creates new alliances. So the United States creates military and economic alliances with former Axis powers. And so, we have the Marshall Plan, which starts to rebuild Germany. We become friends with Japan, and we agree to rebuild Japan as long as they don't develop a military. And so the Marshall Plan rebuilds Europe and Japan. We create NATO. And so there's this real emphasis after World War II on creating these military and economic alliances, even with the people that lost World War II, in particular with the people who lost World War II, in order to create this sort of moment of global stability. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, creates sort of somewhat temporary alliances with China, and they also create the Warsaw Pact. And so the Warsaw Pact creates basically NATO-like agreement with East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, that basically organizes Central Europe under the influence of the Soviet Union. And then there's division between the United States and the Soviet Union over Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Obviously, it also leads to this massive nuclear arms race and to this policy of mutually assured destruction. So both the United States and the Soviet Union start building up their arsenals. And the United States engages in this policy of destabilization of countries that might lead communists. So Iran, we start to either depose governments that might lean communist, or to impose governments that we think will be friendly to us. So this includes Iran in 1952, Guatemala in 1954, the Congo 61, Cuba in 61, the Dominican Republic in 62, Chile in 71, Nicaragua for 10 years. And so while we are destabilizing these countries, the Soviet Union is using military force to maintain communism. And so one of the important things I think to realize about the Cold War is much of the reason that you see destabilized governments, or sort of governments that are slow to develop at this point, largely has to do with the intentional policy of meddling that the United States and Soviet Union adopted during the Cold War. But I think the other thing that's important to realize is that even though the Cold War is over, many of these sort of proxy battles still sort of exist. And so our relationship with Iran is still affected. Our relationship with Cuba is obviously still one that's sort of in flux. And obviously, just like, I think there are major parallels in some ways between the Pax Britannica and the Cold War, where although there's no war between countries during Pax Britannica, or very little, there's lots of internal conflict. The same is true of the Cold War. And so there are these proxy battles that are fought between the United States and the Soviet Union in order to sort of keep the United States and the Soviet Union from going to war. We engage in these proxy wars all over the globe. So this is what the world looks like in 1980. And so you can see the dark blue are NATO allies. The red are Warsaw Pact allies. And then you have socialist countries that are allied with the USSR, other allies of the USSR, a few non-aligned countries here and there. And then what the X's are in countries where you see red X's, there are communist guerrillas. And so those are insurgency parties like FARC in Colombia that are trying to depose the government and influence and, basically have a revolution, a communist revolution. And then the blue X's are anti-communist guerrillas that exist in these countries to overthrow communist governments and implement a capitalist government instead. And so this is the way that the globe becomes divided up in 1980. So this class is about what happens next, about the sort of the end of the Cold War, decolonization, entering this age of globalization. And the framework that we'll use to understand this, and the framework that I think helps to explain what's happening now, is interests, interactions, and institutions. And so when we're looking at these different moments in political history, I think it helps to say, what are the interests of the actors? So who are the actors? What do they want to achieve through political action? What are their preferences? Interactions, and so the ways that two or more actors' choices combine to produce political outcomes. And these are often driven by bargaining and cooperation. And then institutions, and so how a set of rules structure or govern political interactions. And so we've talked today about the 5 big eras in sort of modern history. So mercantilism, Pax Britannica, the 30 Years Crisis, Cold War, and then this moment of globalization. And so what we'll start talking about next is this idea of how we study these things systematically, and so why it's called political science, what makes it a science, and also what happens within states. And so how do states sort of make decisions? How do they structure themselves politically and economically, and things like that.